Brown Bag Seminar series. Today we are going to have the Brown Bag Seminar presentation entitled Sustainability of Agroecological Intervention in Small-Scale Milpa-based Systems in the Western Highlands of Guatemala by Carlos Gonzalez-Esquivel from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM, Instituto de Investigaciones en Ecosistemas y Sustentabilidad. Carlos Gonzalez-Esquivel has a first degree in veterinary medicine and animal production from the University of the State of Mexico and a PhD in agroecology from the University of London. He has over 20 years experience in agroecosystems and analysis and sustainability evaluation, having worked at the University of the State of Mexico and the University of East Anglia at the United Kingdom. As part of the MESMIS team, he has conducted and taken part in numerous workshops, graduate and undergraduate theses, and research papers on sustainability evaluation in agroecosystems. Other research areas include silvopastoral systems, forage science, biological control, and organic horticulture. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is part of a project where I have been collaborating with CIMIT, specifically with Santiago López Ridaura. Guatemala is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, and the Western Highlands are one of the poorest regions in Guatemala. It's dominated by indigenous population, and there is a long history of interventions by development agencies concentrated in farming systems. Just to give you an idea, this is a typical landscape of the Western Highlands, very steep landscape. Most of the area is cultivated. There are very few remaining patches of forests. But as you saw in the previous slide, the land availability it's quite small. It's less than half a hectare, and the families are quite large still. You know about milpa systems. The milpa is the Mesoamerican combination of maize, beans or fava beans, squash and other crops. There is a high diversity of maize varieties in the region, but many farmers are now changing this milpa system to monocrop maize. There is a wide range of altitudinal variation, and in the highest areas, farmers have other crops, mainly potatoes and sheep. In lower areas, this changes to fruit crops such as citrus or also coffee production, which is also very important. So there is basically no land is uncultivated. Every little space is used by farmers. In some cases where irrigation is available, farmers can have two crops a year. So the rainy season, the rain-fed crop would be maize, or as a monocrop, or in milpa, and during the dry season you would have mainly irrigated horticulture for the local, national, or even international markets. The Buena Milpa Feed the Future project was financed by the US aid operated by CIMIT and implemented through collaborating NGOs. There was an agreement with a Mexican NGO, HIRA, to carry out the sustainability evaluation. So we organized a team with extension agents from the NGOs and agronomy lecturers and students from the University of San Carlos, which is the main public university in Guatemala, to carry out the evaluation. About sustainability evaluation, we use the MESMIS framework. MESMIS is the Spanish acronym for the framework for the evaluation of management systems using indicators. This is an adaptation of another framework developed by FAO in the 1990s, the framework for the evaluation of sustainable land management, adapted for peasant agroecosystems in Latin America, designed as a flexible decision-making tool in which, unlike other frameworks in which indicators are previously defined, here in MESMIS, the idea is to define criteria and indicators in a participatory way. So indicators are going to be different for each particular context. There are over 120 study cases recorded from the year 2000 in over 20 countries, and not only to assess farming systems, but nowadays the framework is being used to assess technical schools, cooperatives, and other systems which are not necessarily farming systems or agroecosystems as we conceive them. So this is the location of the study cases. Obviously, most of them are in Mexico, where the framework originated, in Spanish-speaking countries, but also more frequently we have cases in places where we never thought we would have the MESMIS framework applied. It's not only the framework that we work with. We try to follow up case studies and put them in a dedicated website. We organize courses in both Mexico and other Latin American countries. It's part of numerous graduate and undergraduate programs across Latin America. And there is also the development of interactive models for with teaching purposes, so that people at home could find out about sustainability attributes, which is what I'm going to describe now. So you know there are many hundreds of definitions of sustainability. How we define sustainability in agroecosystems? Well, agroecosystems must be highly productive, not only for farming families, but also for all of us who are not farmers. Production should be reliable, stable, resilient. It has to be flexible or adaptable to respond to changing biophysical or socio-economic conditions. The costs and benefits have to be distributed in an equitable way. And also, agroecosystems must have an acceptable level of agency or self-reliance to respond to and control externally induced changes. So, this one is in Spanish, but if an agroecosystem meets all these 7 attributes, then we can say that it is sustainable. In general terms, how the framework works, from these 7 attributes, we define the system to be evaluated, whether it is a farm or a community or a watershed. I mean, the time and scale, the time and space scale, and the socio-environmental context in which these systems are developing. From here, we define critical points and in the diagnostic criteria and indicators in the 3 evaluation areas: environmental, economic, and social. So we make sure that all aspects of an agroecosystems are covered. What I want to say, my motivation in this last over 20 years working with sustainability evaluation has always been the big question is whether alternative systems are more sustainable than conventional systems. Alternative systems could be organic, low external input. We could find out whether systems with conservation agriculture are more sustainable than traditional or conventional systems. So we need a multidisciplinary tool to evaluate this, not only in productive terms. Most development projects evaluate the success of a technology based on yields or based on cost benefit. These are the two most commonly used indicators, but this type of evaluations leave out other aspects, environmental aspects, social aspects, adoption aspects, equity. Well, we're going to see with more detail what we did in the Western Highlands. So we selected 5 study cases in 5 municipalities working with 4 NGOs, and the type of interventions that the NGOs have carried out in the communities include, for example, vermicomposts, horticulture, seed banks, market diversification, in other cases rainwater harvest or greywater treatment, reforestation, crop diversification, or participatory crop breeding. And some of the NGOs have been working in the communities for over 10 years, whereas some of them have only been working in the communities for a short time. This is the location of the study cases: Guatemala City, Quetzaltenango, which is the second most important city in Guatemala, is somewhere around here. This is all the Western Highlands region bordering with Mexico. So we carry out training workshops with staff, students, extension agents, including field visits. We selected 10 farms with long-term collaboration with the NGO as an alternative system, and the farms of recent incorporation as reference systems. So this is important. We cannot evaluate sustainability per se as such, but it's easier to evaluate sustainability if we compare, if we make it comparatively. Alternative systems versus reference system would be a typical comparison. We tried to select, to make these 10 contrasting farms similar in terms of size, for example, in terms of management and productive diversity, so they are comparable. And we collected data for one cropping cycle. Part of the training workshops, part of the interviews with extension agents of the NGOs. So the first result is describing the system. So we did this with the agronomy students. This is one case study, the traditional system, where the family grows staple crops: maize, beans, faba, some fruit trees, some small livestock, some large livestock. Part of the production goes to the family, but also to the local market. And it's very important that most families have off-farm income, either as laborers, or they have remittances from family members who have migrated to the US. This is very important, actually. In the alternative or agroecological system promoted by the NGO, you can see all the additions, all the interventions, like composting the manure, including other animals such as rabbits and goats, greywater treatment, rain harvesting, reforestation, also including other crops, horticultural crops mainly, and obviously there is an important technical assistance input. In this other case, in Todos Santos, sorry, again, this one is in Spanish. This would be the reference system. An important component in the alternative system would be composting, seed banks, diversifying horticultural crops or fruit crops, including new crops, and also diversifying markets, not only the local market, but seeking for other markets. This is an example of the seed banks. These are community seed banks now operated and run by the local farmers. This is going to be very important in the future because droughts are going to be more recurrent, and in some cases, due to small areas, farmers don't even harvest enough seed for the next cropping cycle. So this is one of the main aspects promoted by the NGO in this case. Okay, let's go to the indicators. Obviously, we measured yield for maize and beans. We measured it in quintales by cuerda, which are the local measuring units. That's how farmers give the information. 1 quintal is 50 kilograms, and 1 cuerda is more or less 400 square meters. We also measured cash crop yield and the cost benefit of cash crops. We did not measure cost benefit for maize and beans because it's not the objective for maize and beans to be sold as cash crops. If we did that type of evaluation, and it has happened in other study cases, it's not profitable. Maize or beans, the staple crops, are not profitable, but the purpose is different. In terms of food security, we evaluated maize availability, beans availability, and meat availability in terms of the number of consumed animals. Mainly small animals, no? Poultry, sometimes sheep or goats. In terms of stability, resilience, reliability, adaptability, and self-reliance, we measured crop and livestock diversification, losses to pests and diseases, losses to extreme weather events, the number of soil and water conservation practices used by farmers, the use of organic fertilizers, the cost of purchased inputs, and the percentage of farmers receiving support and receiving assistance. Support, many organizations in the region give direct financial support to farmers. And finally, a gender equity index, and we asked farmers who carries out the different agricultural tasks, like sowing, weeding, harvesting, etc. And our ideal value would be that they are equally distributed. However, if men carries out more than 50% of agricultural tasks, this is still considered equitable. So it's inequitable when women carry out more than half of agricultural tasks. So if men carry out more than half of agricultural tasks, this is not considered inequitable because obviously women are known or they have to carry out household tasks as well. Probably many of you have seen this type of diagrams, radar graphs or amoeba graphs. These are visual tools to help us see rapidly which indicators perform better in each system. So 100 is our optimum or ideal value, and 0 would be the worst possible value. In the case of Todos Santos, if you remember, Todos Santos is the case where the NGO has had more time intervening. So you can see how the difference between the alternative system and the reference system is remarkable in terms of yields, in terms of cost benefit, maize availability. There are small improvements, so the values are almost similar in other indicators. It doesn't improve too much in terms of crop losses. More farmers use organic fertilizers, but the cost of purchased inputs is lower in terms of the reference system. So sometimes some interventions include or imply higher higher external input costs. It's not always black and white. Okay, there are no big difference in terms of farmers receiving assistance or in gender equity. This is the case where the interventions only started 3 years ago. And also in this study case, the interventions were only related to participatory breeding. So there are no improvements in terms of composting or introducing small livestock. So the interventions are more limited. And you can see that there is almost no difference between the reference and the alternative systems, apart from the number of farmers receiving support or assistance. So, in this table, we are showing the percentage of difference between the alternative and the reference system. So when values are positive, the alternative system is performing better than the reference system. And when values are negative, it's the opposite. The reference system is performing better than the alternative one. So what we can see is generally moderate improvements in terms of the alternative system in most cases. Remember that this is the case with the longer term interventions, so you can see more improvements. Also, very high improvements in terms of, farmers using organic fertilizers, receiving support, receiving assistance. It's interesting what happened here. I was quite startled to see this figure. This is a case where most farmers are women. Women are heading farming units. So obviously when an NGO or someone is promoting an intervention, most of the added labor required goes to the female members of the household. So this is why we see a sharp decrease in farm task distribution by gender. Most heads, as I said, most farm heads are women. Right. To end up these conclusions and recommendations, these type of interventions are the main vehicle for NGOs and local actors to contribute towards rural development. But in most cases, we don't know which is the impact. And you must have heard about projects everywhere around the world where we don't have an estimation of the impact of an intervention. So this is the importance of applying a sustainability evaluation framework. There are other frameworks. There is the IDEA framework, SAFE, SAFA. There are plenty of frameworks available. It's not that important if you don't use the MESMIS framework. The important thing is to find out about the impact of interventions, to find out whether really alternative systems are more sustainable than reference or traditional or conventional ones. And this should give us tools for decision making for farmers, academics, and extension agents alike. We found moderate improvements in indicators such as yield, crop and livestock diversity, soil and water conservation practices, but we have to recognize that small farm sizes and big family sizes make unlikely that these systems can reach food self-sufficiency. Remember that this was part of the Feed the Future project, and similar projects aim at food self-sufficiency, and they also aim for agriculture as being the main income source for farmers, that farmers do not have to rely on other income sources. Well, given the farm size and the geographical conditions, this is highly unlikely. Farmers will have to keep relying on off-farm income, on other activities. However, farms where where 2 crops a year can be grown, well, they can maintain a stable income. We did not measure this, but we think that the extra income from horticultural crops is used to to purchase food during the dry season. This is also the case for farms with fruit trees, with citrus or coffee. Well, we think that they get enough income to cover their food needs for the rest of the year. Small livestock, this is very important because promoting small livestock such as goats or rabbits is aimed at improving the diet, and it was proved in some of the study cases. Families are consuming more animals per month, so well, they have a better diet. But when talking in detail with some of these families, they realize that they want animals because they are a source of fertilizer for their milpas, therefore reducing external costs. Well, the impact, as I said, in food security is moderate, the number of months per year. In only one of the study cases, farms achieve self-sufficiency, maize and bean self-sufficiency for the whole year. In other cases, they improve from 3 months to 5 months a year. The rest of the year, they have to keep purchasing maize and beans. More importantly, they increase the use of soil and water conservation practices and reduced external input dependence. So we think in the longer term, this is going to be positive. This is an aspect that it was promoted by the Buena Milpa project, soil conservation. Still, well, I'm going to talk about this a bit later. Systems with longer-term interventions had generally higher values. So it's very difficult to find positive impacts after 1 year or 2 years. It's better to evaluate the impacts after long-term interventions. The technical assistance did not necessarily increase productivity indicators, and the interventions are not addressing crop losses. This is going to be very important in the future. So interventions are needed to address crop losses to pests, diseases, and more importantly, extreme weather events, extreme droughts, hailstorms, floods. We could not directly measure things that were very important to us, like soil quality or erosion, the capacity of the team. Well, we didn't have resources to analyze soils in the lab or to make field measurements, but these are indicators that should be taken into account in the future. And we also need to better understand the dynamics of food security and the peaks of labor and food shortage along the year. And finally, well, we made a very successful collaboration with the local NGOs and the staff and students at the university. So I think we advanced in an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or even transdisciplinary approach. Even though all the staff and students were agronomists, well, we tried to look beyond the field, beyond the crop, beyond the livestock, into the livelihoods of families. No, even things like gender equity that we did not really know how to measure them. Well, we made an effort in this respect. Well, just to highlight the importance of measuring soil erosion, it's a very, very important problem in our view in the region, and not much is being done about it. The interventions are not really addressing erosion control. Well, we just submitted a manuscript last month to the International Journal of Agricultural Sustainability with the collaborators. acknowledgements go obviously to participating farmers, lecturers and students at the University of San Carlos, the collaborating NGOs, and personally to my colleague Santiago Lopez Ridaura for inviting me to this project. We have enjoyed very much working with the NGOs, the farmers, the students in Guatemala. Thank you very much. Sorry, this is the dedicated website of the MESMIS program, where you can find the database of study cases, the framework, and other related information on courses and workshops. Mm-hmm.
Hmm? Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.
Yeah, MESMIS is an old framework. You mentioned the 1990s and wide application, especially in Latin America. How did that framework evolve from the learning of using it? I mean, I have the feeling that's quite fixed and the framework remained the same. That's my first question. And the second one is on your spider webs or your amoeba diagrams. Looks like there are no trade-offs in what you show. And is it because you're working on means and not looking at individuals? I mean, can you use the MESMIS framework to look at outliers, positive deviance and things like that, or not?
In terms of the first question, frameworks have evolved in the last 20 years after MESMIS was published, but most of the frameworks have not been applied. I mean, most of the frameworks are theoretical exercises, and you can make them more and more complex and try to include more aspects of sustainability. But still, I think, well, we proposed an improved framework that was in 2012, and we proposed to include modeling, participatory modeling, scenario building, but yet nobody has applied this improved framework. I think at this level, it's a simple enough framework that can be applied by technicians with relatively with no postgraduate studies, for example. No, even there is a handbook for the extension agent that is in very simple language. So maybe the idea of keeping the framework like that is that almost everyone could apply it, even with little advanced instruction. No? But I think one of the main shortfalls of the MESMIS framework is that in most study cases, people are applying it only in one cropping cycle or in 1 year. So if you had the luck of a very good year in terms of rainfall, well, your results are going to be very nice. Or if you had a very bad year, your results are going to be also very bad. But there are very few studies in which the people applying the framework do so during 2 or 3 or more cycles. That is really what we would like to have in order to have comparisons. Even in this case, we could only have 1 cropping cycle, then the project ended. We would expect the NGOs to keep applying the framework, but for that we need resources. It's always the question of where do we get resources to evaluate sustainability in a continuous way. Sorry.
So can I just, on that, the time dimension, you have few of your indicators, stability, reliability, resilience, are time variables that you say you do a one-shot assessment, so you cannot capture those things.
Not really, no. No, we would need to have, we could have measurements of yields over a number of years and evaluate the percentage of variation. Or I'm in a project in Guerrero in southern Mexico where there was a hurricane a few years ago, And we are trying to evaluate how quickly yields recovered after a terrible year. But yes, with 1 year it's very difficult or impossible to evaluate resilience. And your second question was?
Well, on the trade-offs, there are no trade-offs in your spider web or your diagrams. And the fact that it's, looking at individual farms and positive or negative deviance on the diversity of situations. Because you do it per sites, but when the spider webs, you show there's no line crossing each other. The second one, there's almost no difference. Maybe it's a time issue as well. And the first one is just, major improvement all around.
Probably the main trade-off that we can see here is in some cases in the cost of purchased inputs. When you have to I don't know, start horticultural crops for the dry season, then you need more inputs, irrigation, seeds. Therefore, yields are increased, income is increased, but also external input use is increased. That would probably be the main trade-off that we saw here.
So thanks for the presentation. It's predictable that I'm asking the question, and I think the question is also predictable because it's always the same. So this time also, you're talking about the farming systems and comparing farming systems within let's say a project, comparing projects, life cycles, etc., right? But sustainability is largely dependent on what happens in the real world, right? Did you have some indications of what's happening beyond this project context, beyond the farm, let's say, changes in the market or private sector providing knowledge services, things that are not provided by the fake realities of the projects? For that's maybe real sustainability, right?
No, I agree. It's interventions sometimes, or interventions many times are aimed at increasing productivity, and there goes the farmer investing all his or her effort in increasing productivity, and then when you get to the market, the prices drop down. So there are many other political, economic factors that need to be taken into account. What is the reason for increasing yields if there's not going to be an equitable market for your produce? But yet I see most extension agencies or development agencies pushing yields up, not looking at the cost of inputs, not looking at the environmental impact, not looking at making markets more fair.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And as an outsider to MESMIS, I have a couple of questions. Maybe you're working on them. The first is, these are the indicators that you have in your amoeba presentation, but it gives no idea of the weighting of each of those to a different family. So would they be more interested in increasing maize yield or the cost of purchased inputs and the like? So do you have any opinion about how you can weight these various indicators? And the second one is, one indicator that I find missing there, although you made a sort of a cursory mention of it, is the availability of labor. So these agroecological interventions, they all have a cost in terms of time and labor. And you haven't considered those. And you haven't also, as far as I can see, considered the sort of the offsets between labor spent in these agroecological interventions and the possible use of labor as labor markets, because you did mention labor scarcity, I think. So was that scarcity because labor was being used elsewhere, or was it some other reason that you had mentioned it? Thank you.
Okay, yes, it's very important. Yeah, you could carry out what is called a multi-criteria analysis, where you assign a different weight to each indicator. Obviously, I said earlier that in many projects the only things that are measured are yields or cost benefit. These are still very important indicators, and are if I put them in the radar graph, they all look as having the same importance. But yes, I agree. You could carry out a multi-criteria analysis to ask farmers or extension agents or academics how, well, if they assign different weights to each indicator and have a different outcome. Obviously, for academics, environmental indicators might be better rated. So yeah, it's probably a shortfall also of the framework. And in terms of labor, yeah, we did not look in detail at the labor market. Most farms, even though they're quite small farms, they tend to use some external labor, and at the same time, they also participate in the labor market. In some, that's why we need to look at it in a more seasonal way. In some at some times of the year, people migrate to towns or cities or work in other farms, and this is something that has to be looked at with more detail. I don't know if Santiago, if you have more information on how this works, but almost every farm has people working outside, but also most farms also hire labor for some harvesting some times of the year. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and then I ask. Okay. Well, maybe I will change a bit the discussion, but then you can go again, Santiago. So thank you for the presentation. And I think since I was in bachelor's, I was amazed about this framework, so it's very interesting for me. But can you explain more about some examples of how the use of this framework at the end turn into outcomes or changes into the interventions or the project at some point? Because it's very nice to understand where are we, but then what do you do with this information at the end?
Okay. Ideally, yeah. Once you have this concentrated information, you should be able to take decisions on whether to carry on with the same strategy or change strategy. Whether there are trade-offs, as Bruno said. If you're increasing yields, but you are also increasing erosion, you're doing something wrong. Or as I said earlier, the alternative systems do not always perform better than the reference ones. So this is this should be taken as a decision-making tool to decide whether to carry on with these interventions or do things differently. Also to find, ideally all indicators should be at least above 75%. That would be for me an acceptable level. So you want to increase, let's say, livestock diversity or meat availability, but without trade-offs, without decreasing the values in other indicators. In practice, in reality, what has happened with most of these 120 cases where MESMIS has been applied, it has been mostly an academic exercise. That is also a shortfall. People are applying the framework independent of the MESMIS team, but in many cases these are master's thesis, PhD thesis, and okay, we get to this result, but this is not the end. What we really want is this to be a tool for changing towards more sustainable systems. Also, not always the reference, we tend to say, okay, the conventional system, we don't like it because I am part of the agroecology lab and I always want the agroecological systems to perform better, but this does not always happen. We can also improve sustainability of conventional systems, of traditional systems. We should not only focus on alternative systems. So this is a tool not only for the alternative systems, but also for the conventional systems. In many cases, many farmers cannot change to, let's say, organic farming. For many reasons, they are going to remain conventional. So we need to give them tools so that they can improve, and not only in economic or productive terms, but also in environmental and social aspects. Mm-hmm.
May I add a bit to that? I think it's more of a discussion or reflection tool. So in this case, we had one in Michoacán where they started with a highly diversified maize-based system as an alternative. And after the first evaluation, they realized that it was too much, too complicated, so they sort of decreased the number of species within the milpa system that they had. And it's like in the discussion with Asokuch, the ones that developed the case study. So that's the idea, no, of having this developed with the NGOs or by the NGOs with the help of the students. So even with the discussion of Asokuch, the organization doing the Cuchumatanes, they were very much into saying, look, our system performs very well, no? But yeah, we could tell them, yeah, but it has an important burden in terms of the cost of purchased inputs. So I say, why don't we try to generate internally these inputs? So they start working on local seed production so that farmers produce their own vegetable seeds and stuff like that. So I guess that's a little bit it's a slow process, and what it tries to do is to transparent the advantages and disadvantages. So I think the trade-offs are very explicit in the radar graphs, right? Because most of the times we see this kind of crossing of saying, yeah, you have better yields, but you have higher monetary cost. And then I think our work as scientists is to make that explicit to the NGOs, to the local NGOs, the projects or whoever wants to slowly improving the sustainability of the system by trying to flatten these trade-offs. We have made a trade-off and synergies analysis, but more of a meta-analysis of different case studies, where we see, okay, all the case studies that increased, I don't remember anymore, diversity, no? Also increased in terms of biomass production or productivity in general. So we see some synergies between diversity and productivity and some trade-offs between productivity and monetary cost. So more the trade-offs, we are at the local level, at the case study level, it should come like that, no? Where we see already a trade-off of the action of the NGO, where they improve the performance in productive terms, but they have not very much better performance in more environmental terms, and they have an economic, let's say, problem because they need to purchase inputs. So the trade-offs is slightly there. One other thing that I think is important to mention is that as the MESMIS has this, is based on attributes of sustainable systems rather than indicators. So what we normally do is with the collaborators, the NGOs, we engage in a discussion for the selection of indicators, right? So we say, okay, let's talk about resilience. So we don't necessarily need to measure stuff along the years to find you can say, okay, for you, what is a resilience? What's a problem of a shock? And then they say, well, our main shock problems is these extreme climatic events. And then you can derive an indicator of saying, okay, what is the percentage of losses, no, when you have these extreme weather events? So that would be an indicator of your resilience. It's just a proxy indicator of what will look like the resilience of the system, and you don't need to necessarily...
The system they are using, but not with the alternative proposed system.
Well, they were doing 10 years, so these are two groups of farmers. The ones that are
implemented the NGO for 10 years and the ones that not. So you ask them, okay, what is your percentage of losses in terms when you have an extreme weather event? And those are averages of the different farmers. So they are talking about, they know the system, it's with farmers. No? And it's the same issue, and I'm surprised also now that you mentioned here is, as it is very participatory process of deriving which are the good indicators, that labor didn't come out as something in either productivity of labor or labor shortages or something in some way or another in the discussion with farmers and technicians done by the local university staff and students, labor didn't come out. That's the reason we, in the discussion and conclusion of this paper, we say, well, probably looking at labor peaks and labor demand and all that, it will be an important...
Implicitly the gender part is...
Implicitly the gender, so, but also if I will be a gender expert, like Marion, you will say, that's quite a poor indicator, no? The distribution 50-50. But that's the problem with this kind of integrated assessment is that they are all shallow, poorly informed indicators. So each specialist of pests and diseases, it will tell you that your indicator of pest and diseases losses in maize is not a good indicator. The soil and water conservation person will tell you. So each of these indicators, there is a specialist which will probably contest the value of the indicator. And I think that's more of a methodological trade-off. Either you spread thin and have a multi-criteria view of the thing, or you concentrate in your disciplinary. And I guess we have to play between the two, going deep into disciplinary and going up into more integrated, let's say, assessment. No? But for me, just to finish, as a CIMIT, the most value of this project is that we manage, as CIMIT, to put NGOs, local universities, together with a Mexican university, to work together into a new methodological implementation. We were surprised to see that out of 120 case studies in Latin America, there was none in Guatemala. I don't understand why. I think the MESMIS came when there was the political problems in Guatemala, so they didn't have this implementation. But then at the end, as CIMIT, that's a bit our work, no? To say we have a Mexican university collaborating with a Guatemalan university, with the students' exchanges and working with local NGOs. And in some way, we as International Center, we fulfill our mission. No? For me, that's the most valuable part of this collaboration is that. No?
Last one. Time is almost done, I think. Thanks for this. Brought some good memories from working there. Yes. I have a general question. If I look at the landscape in the Western Highlands and I compare it to, I don't know, Bolaita area in Ethiopia, which is called the Green Hunger, very similar, Rwanda, Burundi. To me, I have a background in soil conservation a long time ago, so to me the only sustainable systems that you could really have there is forest, or maybe super well-managed agroforestry system with coffee or something else, yeah? Everything else is, I wouldn't consider as sustainable at all. Did you see anything there that you would consider as sustainable, or has it ever come up in discussions that in these areas people probably shouldn't do cropping systems, you know? On the long run. What I found interesting with USAID, it was the first example ever with a development agency. When we started discussing, they said, we defined areas before we started with Feed the Future, where we said it's not worth working there because no market access, yeah, very high up, highly degraded already. So that was a step in the right direction. But if you look at the whole area, I don't know how that's ever going to be sustainable. So I don't know how you tackle those things.
Well, yeah, it goes beyond our scope. And we were discussing this morning with Santiago. Well, in the tropical areas of Guatemala near the coast, there are really large properties, no, of people growing banana and coffee or livestock. So it's a question of land reform. How come families in the Western Highlands have 0.3 hectares, and in the tropics, people can have hundreds of hectares. That's a point, but okay, let's say we carry on working in the Western Highlands. Yes, I would think highly integrated agroforestry systems, MIAFs, milpa integrated with lots of trees as life barriers. Maybe that would reduce erosion, and it's always when we ask farmers about this, they would say, "Oh no, but trees are taking up valuable space. I need to grow maize and beans." So it doesn't look like in the short term or in the medium term the situation is going to change. This is a region that expels lots of migrants, and the solution is not in agricultural innovations or agroecological innovations. No, it goes well beyond that, unfortunately. You had a question earlier?
Looking at the right side of this graph, this amoeba graph, those all link into human health factors. I mean, if you have increased availability of protein over more of the year, you have less stunting, childhood stunting and things like that. Mm-hmm. Do they ever get brought into this framework because you are potentially improving the livelihoods or the health benefits of the system, but as Kai says, it's maybe not sustainable, but
it's not enough.
It's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction, but the external inputs are more valuable, I think, in the long run. It's not a system that's going to...
No, farmers would have to keep relying on off-farm income to achieve food security.
Yeah, but the thing is that your alternative system is improving availability across the whole season of beans, as meat, crop diversity. So all those are improving the potential benefits for human health concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, apparently so.
They are like we can say that it's a proxy indicator on the. But then when I've checked data of this area, and the problem is that as they have so low food self-sufficiency, they buy a lot of stuff, and you don't know what they buy. So whatever change you see in the agricultural part not necessarily reflects on the health part, because there is a lot of noise in terms of what they buy, what they eat, etc. So we looked at data in stunting, anemia, like blood samples they took and everything. Impossible to find a relationship with agriculture because there is a 50% noise in terms of the food they purchase, and you lose control there. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much, Carlos.
Thank you
very much, everybody, for coming here, and let's keep working. Actually, Carlos is working with Carolina Camacho in the application of the MESMIS framework in Yucatan, and we are going to try to include them to work with us in the IFAD Bolivia crop livestock project.
So the next year, the presentation would be on the indicators for the milpa systems in Yucatan.
In Yucatan, perfect.
Hopefully.
Thanks.